Hi everyone, you've clicked on this video because you're determined to find out what really happened, what happened next, and some of the secrets from the game. As I mentioned in the kind of the placeholder video that I put in Canvas, I put it in a discussion format so that way you can share secrets with one another as well. As I said, you're okay to do that. Just keep it in the class. Don't be spreading it all over campus and ruining the fun for the next classes. So the next thing that we need to do, one thing that these videos do not contain is announcement of like who our winners were, because the winners get determined, as you know, based on how successful your faction was. So there's a couple of factions in the running still, and what we need to do is look at your write-ups to figure out more of what went on behind the scenes. Now, Ms. Fano and I, as you know, were active on your Discord and kept an eye on everything and answered your questions. But yeah, as you know, it was a hectic couple of weeks, so we'll have missed stuff. And so we want to go through your write-ups and make sure we didn't miss anything. And once we've done that, then we'll make the formal announcement as to who the winning faction was. So whoever achieved their goals, their faction goals, are eligible to be the winner. So if you're like, yeah, we didn't achieve our faction goals, I'm sorry, you're not going to have been the winning faction. So this postmortem is an opportunity to discuss your hidden goals with one another and understand the game outcomes a little bit better. And as I said, I encourage you to use informal chat to help one another see why your characters behaved the way they did. And often this helps resolve many outstanding questions. However, if you still, after watching these videos and looking at the forum posts, have questions that are best directed to me or Ms. Fano, then please just ask them in the forum and we'll do our very best to get back to you. Now, what we're not going to do is copy and paste all the rule sheets in, because we've got to use them again. So, but we'll tell you things within reason. So, what really happened? So this was not the only raid experienced by the inhabitants of Iona. The first documented raid there occurred in 795. So that was only 2 years after the first documented Viking raid. And that, of course, was 793 on the monastery of Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne isn't shown on this map on the right because it wasn't a Columban monastery, but it was the other side of the Great Britain, the island of Great Britain. So it's in the northeast, an island off the northeast of England, whereas Iona is an island off the northwest of the British Isles. So that was only 2 years later. They obviously knew that monasteries were where it was at, and that's definitely given to us by the primary sources that you were reading, like the sale of the nun at Hedeby, that even before they started to raid, they had knowledge of Christianity, they had knowledge of monasteries, they knew how they worked, and that they were easy targets. And of course, this was rapidly borne out. So this means that Iona was raided a number of times. 795 was the first, 802, 806, and 825. And of course, 825 was the one we were interested in. So the raid of 795 was entirely new to them. The ones from 802 and 806 were very devastating to the island. A lot of the inhabitants of Iona left after the raid of 802 because in the raid of 802, 68 died among the tenants and the monks. So, tenants and monks, you did well. You only lost 2 of your numbers. 68 of them were killed in real life by Vikings in 802. Not only were 68 killed, but the monastery was burned. So the name of the landing place where the ferry still comes in today, which would have been where the Vikings landed as well, is still known as Martyrs Bay, and that's because of the 68 who were murdered by Vikings there in 802. So the monastery was burned, which indicates that a lot of it was made out of wood. And the archaeology, of course, which you saw in the lecture video before we got started, holds out that they were made out of wood. So more monks left after 806 and even more left after 825, the event when our game was set. Now, this is actually something that historically we thought pretty much everybody left after 825, and then the publication of the excavations by Adrian Maldonado and by Ewan Campbell, which they didn't excavate. A guy called Charles Thomas excavated like a long time ago, but he never published his findings. And Maldonado and Campbell went through all of the excavation stuff and published it. And the archaeological evidence is that, yeah, the population went down after 825, but actually the monastery stayed very active after 825. Some of them seem to have left, a lot more seem to have stayed, and it remained a pretty vibrant religious centre with pilgrims visiting. So after 825, it does appear that the monks in particular sat down and decided, what are we going to do? We've now been raided a number of times. And as the archaeology indicates, some stayed, but some did leave. And they went to a place, another Columban Federation monastery called Kells, which I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but I'm circling it if you can see my cursor, but if not, it's kind of the one in the middle of Ireland. So it's inland, it's in the east of Ireland, it's another Columban foundation, and Tomas was supposed to be the diplomat representing the Columban Federation in the game. So he was there to represent the likes of Kells and their interests during the raid. Hence the naming of the Book of Kells, which I'm going to come to in a minute. So Kells was founded actually earlier than the Scottish monasteries. The Irish monasteries founded by St. Columba were founded first. And indeed, there seems to have been a particular strong link between Kells and Iona. Kells might have been refounded with the arrival of monks from Iona after the 825 raid. Certainly by 825 there was a really good relationship, a very strong relationship between the two monasteries, since we know it's written that in 814 a guy, the abbot was called Kellach, abbot of Iona. He retired to Kells, so he left Iona and went to Kells, so this indicates that they had close relationships. And certainly Iona got raided a lot by Vikings, so a lot of the goods, a lot of the relics from the Abbey of Iona were transferred to other Columban houses that were deemed to be safer, particularly those inland in Ireland, including Raphoe, Dunkeld and Kells. Kells was also raided a number of times because, as we know, Vikings have this amazing shipbuilding technology. This meant that they couldn't just sail up very close on shallow seawater, but they could also sail up rivers, and Kells is on a river. So Kells was raided a number of times, but they never lost their most prized possession, which is known as the Book of Kells. So scholars debate the origin of the Book of Kells, but we do know that it survived a number of Viking raids, and we think that this probably included our raid, the 825 Iona raid, based on the dating that has been done of the book. So, as I said, until the publication of the recent excavations, many people believe that Iona was completely abandoned after the raid of 825. But the archaeology shows us that the island continued to be occupied and was used as a religious site throughout the Middle Ages. Chances are that the Book of Kells, despite the name, it did wind up at Kells at some point, but we do believe that it was at least started, or if not completely finished, in the scriptoria located at Iona. So this would have been, at some point in the book's history, it was started by the monks working in the singular scriptorium in Iona, and then moved to Kells, probably for safekeeping. Here's a link for you to learn more. I mean, there's an awful lot that you can read on the Book of Kells. It's probably one of the most famous medieval books and the most famous example of early medieval art, for sure. But it's pretty neat to think that it survived several Viking raids, and probably our one. In fact, it was probably in real life probably one of the items that was hidden from the Vikings so that they couldn't get their hands on it, which is pretty neat. So, as I said, the history of Iona seems to be that it did continue. Certainly, by the time that the Viking raiding period is well over, it was re-established as a very vibrant Christian centre. The building at the bottom that you see here, the church, you might remember from the Google Street View tour. This is a Romanesque church that was built in the early 13th century, and it replaced the earlier medieval church. We believe that the earlier medieval church would have been on the same site. So it's a Romanesque architectural style. It's pretty actually cutting edge art for its time. And actually that tells us an awful lot too. It tells us that by this time period, Iona still was very well intellectually connected with the rest of Europe. That although it's to us today it appears a tiny little mountainous island off the west coast of Scotland, historically and in the Middle Ages it was a vibrant and well-connected place. Now it wasn't that, as I said, it was pretty new, cutting-edge architecture for its time, and there was one analyst who wrote in 1204, and I quote that he wrote that it wrecked the place greatly. He really hated this new type of architecture. So, in terms of the game characters from the monks and the tenants, the Abbot Finian is a character who has the memory of previous Viking raids. So he would, in the game, had a memory of the massacre of the 68 at Martyrs Bay. And that's because chances are there were monks on the island who had been there for numerous Viking raids and knew what was going to go down and knew what the different things that could happen would be. Even after the game, some of the monks probably went to Kells and followed the hypothetical character of Tomas, but who probably was a real person, maybe not called Tomas, but a real person, to Kells, and others will have stayed on Iona for the rest of their lives. The fact that the Book of Kells ends up at Kells indicates that maybe the workers, the monks who were at the scriptorium, were the ones who particularly left Iona after the 825 raid. But as I said, the existence of the Book of Kells and other texts that we know were written and created at Iona attest to the success of the monks in keeping the hoard hidden in real life. Yes, the hoard was, well, as real as anything can be in a virtual game, but it was based on a real life event. We know that there were hoards. At least after the first raid, maybe even the first raid, the monks knew what was going to go down. They had seen this before. And so what they would do when they saw the Vikings pitch up is they would grab the things that mattered most to them, things like the Book of Kells or the relics of St. Columba. And in one case, they literally grabbed it, went and dug a hole, and hid the hoard in this hole, which they dug into a barrow. And a barrow was a prehistoric burial. The Vikings, in real life, we know suspected that this is exactly what had happened, and that the monks had gone and buried it, and they tried to bully and persuade the monks to give up the location of the hoard, and the monks would not. And so what the Vikings did in real life was they just decided to go and dig up likely parts of the island, kind of like the way our game went, actually, in that the rumors started to spread, and the Vikings were like, oh, I think it's in St. Oran's Chapel. Let's have a look. Oh, I think it's in the cemetery. Whereas in real life, from the accounts that have been left, it does appear that this is exactly what happened in real life. And in real life, just like in our game, the Vikings did not find the hoard. The Book of Kells survives to this day, and the Vikings went away disappointed and empty-handed. So we don't know exactly what was in these real life hoards, but we can make a good guess, and that includes the Book of Kells and the reliquaries and the relics, which is what our theoretical hoard was made up of too. So yes, I know everybody's like, well, where was the hoard? And I kept saying, you can't guess where it is. You need to know. And that was deliberately to reflect what happened in real life. But you did have lots of hints. You didn't uncover the location. So this was the location. It was, here we are, burying it with there were two monks who knew where it was, and those two monks were Columba and Phelim. So you were asking Finian and Tomas and Aidan, and it was Columba and Phelim were the two monks who hid it. There were hints for you that it was Columba and Phelim in the game book. So if you go to the prologue and reread the prologue of the game book, you'll see that it's written from the perspective of Blamak, the monk who was killed by the Vikings. And as you know from the primary sources, he was a real life monk who was killed by the Vikings in the 825 raid. So we made it so that the prologue was told from Blamak's perspective, and he's walking along the coast with what we interpreted as the character of Columba, and they run back to the scriptorium, and in the prologue he describes how he stands guard while other monks run off with what is to become the hoard. So that was your clue. That was a major clue for you, that you needed to look for the monks who were working in the scriptoria, and Phelim and Columba were our two monks who were working in the scriptorium. So that's what the prologue described. And then you had a further hint in Aidan's vision that came to him from St. Columba. And you remember that Aidan's vision was two monks running out of a building. He saw two monks. He couldn't see their faces. That was a hint that you were looking for two of them, which you did settle on, but you settled on two of the wrong monks. They were running out of the scriptorium carrying the goods. And this is where they chose to bury it. They could bury it in the whole island, just like happens in real life. And they picked this kind of rocky crevice, which is located to the south of the village. So this is where it was hidden. This is what I mean about like, no, you're going to really need to know. But you accurately reflected what happened in real life. So as you'll have seen from the primary sources, we do know the names and specific people of some of the characters, but not the vast majority. We know the roles that they had. We see references to monks who worked in the scriptorium. We see references to, we know the abbots are called, well, a lot of them, not all of them. But for the vast majority of the monks, let alone the tenants, and certainly not the Vikings, we don't know their actual real life names. We just know of them as really characters. So the roles were given names contemporary with the time. The characters, of course, were based on real historical people or real historical composites. So based on people we do know about. Many of the Vikings, though, some of them were based on history. But as you know, there's a lot of bias in the sources because it was the monks writing the sources. So they don't tend to have like stopped, pause and, hey, can I interview you and understand why you're doing this? Although Wilfred had the possibility of doing that. So the Vikings are depicted on people in the sagas, and the sagas are literary sources. They're written later. They're supposed to be historical fiction by that point, but we don't know to what extent they depict later medieval Scandinavian cultures as opposed to early 9th century Scandinavian cultures. But Dr. Valente, who co-wrote the game with me, is an expert in this, so at least we've got somebody who really knows to work out what is very likely based on the literary sources as opposed to unlikely. So if anybody's watched the TV show Vikings, you'll notice some similarities, and that's because the Vikings TV show has played fast and loose with the sagas too, whereas we're being far more historically accurate. So another reason why we picked 825 was because it's at a really interesting pivot point in Viking history. 825 is not very long before the Viking raiding period starts to become the Viking trading period. It's not that long after the game events that we have the first documented permanent Viking settlements outside of Scandinavia. So we wanted the game to, possibly be a raid, but also be within the historical possibility of, well, maybe the Vikings are going to stay. Maybe they're going to establish trading routes, and that's how they're going to make their money. The Scandinavians who settled in, well, first they used what we call long forts and overwintered, and then they established permanent trading settlements. And the Scandinavian inhabitants in these places were very good at cultural assimilation. They very quickly formed connections with the local populations, and they did this to enhance their trading opportunities. So, I mean, they immediately started to intermarry with the local population, and they immediately started to convert to Christianity as well. They were quite prepared to give up their old pagan religion for better trading prospects and to better culturally assimilate with the people around them. So that actually was a possible outcome for the game. I mean, we're talking maybe 5 years ahead of the first documented permanent Viking settlement, but certainly within the bounds of historical possibility. It just might not have been documented. So you might have done a deal with each other so the Vikings established a trading settlement nearby. And the Vikings... Sorry, Dr. Clemens is woohooing in the hallway. So it caught me off guard. Maybe he's also glad that Vikings could establish permanent settlements. So although our Viking game characters are generic based on the sagas, there were a wide range of outcomes within historical reality for all our Viking characters. So that's how the game went, in, as you know, in the direction that the two Viking factions returned home, and they were not a complete failure. They went home with some goods and knowledge and 2 slaves to sell and other things to sell as well. They did get some reliquaries, I know, and that was a definite, real historical outcome. But the game could have gone in other directions. Carly's faction could have won. They could have gone on to another monastery and raided another Columban monastery. They could have interacted with the monks and the tenants on a much more positive note, and established connections. Like, hey, we'll not kill you. We'll come back. And if you remember the story of Normandy, and that's the following century, that's not until 9/11. But the deal with Normandy was that they did a deal with the French king, and in exchange for being given land in Normandy, they had to protect it from other Viking raiders. So, we had a lot of very possible historical outcomes, all of which were completely historically possible and accurate. So the outcome of your game was, bang on. They didn't find the Horde. That's what happened in real life. They never found the Horde. I know that you're going to be like, yeah, okay, so what happened with other student games? And the answer is all of the above. In the previous, you're the first totally online asynchronous game that I've played, and thank you so much for being such wonderful and excellent participants. Ms. Fano and I have been really talking about how chuffed we are that you were so good at participating on Discord, and we had so few students who were not participating. We had really great participation, which is very rare in any class, let alone an asynchronous online class, let alone during COVID. So we really appreciate the huge amount of effort that you all put in to make this possible. You were all awesome. Absolutely awesome. So, but yeah, in other classes, they have not played it the same way as you, but in other classes, Carly has won. Carly, off they go and continue to raid into the sunset. We've had your outcome several times. We've had different trading establishments set up. We've had all of the different possibilities within the bounds of historical reality in this game. That makes it pretty neat that there's no predetermined outcome. I don't think anybody died in our game. That was unusual. We usually, I suppose, you did want to get at them. I think you were just a bit too late with the monks, that they weren't there for you to challenge them. And that, I think, is because you were on Discord and you were asynchronous. If we'd been like live over Zoom or in class, we would have known the person was there and to respond. So that's something we can build into in the future. But Honestly, I don't think the game lost anything by not having anybody killed. The risk of having someone killed is they can retaliate and you can be killed. And then if you're a ghost, it's really very, very hard to get anything done, and students get very frustrated with being a ghost. And I do know that I told a couple of students to seriously consider whether they wanted to undo everything they'd done and become a ghost, and the answer was, yeah, no, maybe not. So that's totally fair. Okay, so if you've any other questions, please feel free to post them. Ms. Fano and I will do our best to answer, and you might get the person in that character to wade in and get an answer from them. A reminder too, get your write-up submitted, and then we can go ahead and read them. So, don't submit them and then like a minute after the deadline be like, oh, who won? Like, you got to give us time to read them as well, but we'll be as quick as we can as possible in announcing who the winning faction were. And it'll take us a while to get those write-up grades into your gradebook, but we should be able to get speech and participation grades in the next week or so. So you're going to see your gradebooks being updated. And the participation grade was an effort grade. So if you were like spending way too much time on Discord, you're totally getting an A. So you can give yourself a pat on the back for that. It was an effort based grade. So, okay, fire away, ask your questions, and I hope this has answered a lot of them.